bese befike isivumelwano sokuthi enxa ukuthi lo mbiko lo kade ulindele futhi uphethe okuyinsiza zezimpilo zabantu abathize ngakho bagcina bevumelene ukuthi hayi cha nomcimbi awube khona uthi nakuba kunjalo uyacela ukuthi adlulise nje amazwi enduduzo kulabo abalahlekelwe izihlobo zabo bese phinde efisela laba abalimele ukululama okuphuthumayo kanjengoba kuqhubeka kulesikhathi manje.
Now, together with all the other devastation, one of the consequences of the floods is that the St Lucia Estuary breached naturally for the first time since 2014. And I think many of you have taken the opportunity to see this phenomena that is allowing the functioning of this natural asset to resume and to provide many of the ecosystem services that are so important.
Uthi ngenxa yezikhukhula ezikhona mhlawumbe sonke siyavumelana ukuthi umlomo waseSt Lucia kumbe isizalo saseSt Lucia siye saxhumana nolwandle okokuqala kusuka ngo-2014 ukuthi kusenzakalele nje ngokwendalo ngaphandle kokulekelwa abantu. Uthi uyacabanga ukuthi abanye bethu sebeke baya ngapha nezansi beyobuka nje lokhu ukwenzeka kwendalo osekunesikhathi sakugcina nakuba lo sonke sinokwethu emakhanda ukuthi mhlawumbe ngabe kusho ukuthini komunye nomunye kodwa uyacabanga ukuthi sonke sike sabuka lokho.
Now, this report that I'm releasing to all of you today came about as a result of a decision that followed a workshop that took place in October 2020, where the iSimangaliso Wetland Park Authority took a decision to artificially open the estuary mouth.
Uthike lo mbikazo ukhuluma namhlanje ulandela inhlanganisela eyenzeka ngonyaka ka-2020 lapho kuhlangene khona inhlaka ezahlukene okwathi emveni kwalokho kuhlangana kweinhlaka ezahlukene isimangaliso sabe sesithatha isinqumo sokuthi silekelele umlomo ubuvuleke.
At that time, the Wetland Park Authority explained that the purpose of the breach was to restore the nursery function of the system and to flush out the accumulated silt loads originating from the Mfolozi catchments on the advice of a scientific and technical task team.
Uthi ngaleso sikhathi isimangaliso sathi ukuvula kwasumlomo inhloso yakho ukuthi okokuqala bekwazi ukuhlanganisa ulwandle kanye nechweba ukuvumela ukuthi lezo abofisha abasolwandle bekwazi ukuya ngapha bezozalela echwebeni njengokujwayelekile. Okwesibili ukuthi isimangaliso sasicabanga ukuthi kuzokwenzeka kumbe sasiyivulela khona umlomo ngokuthi sikwazi futhi ukuthi kuguguleke lemfucuza ebilokhu yehle njalo nalemfula engenela lapha kuleli chweba laseSt Lucia.
Now, you all know there was opposition to that decision, and I received an open letter from a group of scientists requesting an independent investigation into the breach and on its effects, as this action directly contravened the recommendations of the Jeff report.
Uthi sonke siyazi ukuthi emveni kokuba kwenzeke lokho isimangaliso sivule umlomo ngabe sengithola incwadi esuka ethimbeni lososayensi ababekhathazekile babenxusa ukuba kuqokwe ithimba eliyimele elizophenya umthelela walokhu kuvulwa komlomo ngendlela okwavulwa ngayo isimangaliso. Okwesibili ababekhala ngakho ukuthi lokhu kuvulwa komlomo kanje kuyaphambana ney'ncomo ezenziwa iproject edume ngokuthi i-Jeff.
And I then asked the department to appoint the independent panel, which they did in October 2021. And despite the COVID-19 pandemic and all the restrictions, the panel not only did research work, but they met with many of yourselves as well as scientists. They did a review of the legislative environment, and I received the report on the 28th of March this year.
Uthi ukusuka kubangithole lo ncwadi ngabe senxusa umnyango wami ukuthi uqoke leli thimba labo chwepheshe elaqala umsebenzi walo ngo-October wangonyaka odlule. Okwathi noma kwakuney'ngqinamba ze-COVID esiyazi sonke ithimba lelakwazi ukwenza umsebenzi alenzanga nje kuphela nokuthi lwenze ucwaningo nje kodwa laphinde lahlangana nabanye benu abaningi emveni kwalokho futhi laphinde lakwazi ukuthi ingabe uma ngabe kwenzeka kanje ngabe lokhu kuyahambisana nomthetho. Ithimba ke lelo chwepheshe lalinikwe ukuba lenze umsebenzi walo uthi umbiko wawuthola ngomhla ka-28 kuye kuMbasa.
So at the time that I appointed the panel, I asked it to advise me on 4 things. So the first
uthi ngesikhathi ngiqoka iphanele ngacela uba lingiluleke iy'ntweni ezine nje kuphela. Okokuqala,
the first was the significance and impact of the artificial opening of the estuary mouth and how it relates to the JEF 5 project and the St Lucia Estuary Management Plan.
uthi oqala wathi ukuthi awacela ukuthi ithimba leli libuke ukubaluleka nomthelela wokuvulwa komlomo ngendlela ovulwe ngayo. Okwesibili ebesibuka ukuhlobana kwalokhu ukuvulwa komlomo ngendlela isimali sesavulwe ngayo nayo le J5 report ekhuluma ngayo kanye nokumanejwa nje kwale sizalo esase St Lucia ngokulandela usomqulu wakhona obizwa nge-Estuary Management Plan.
The second was to advise me on what were these exceptional circumstances as provided for in the Estuary Management Plan that led to the decision to breach the mouth, including those of an environmental, social, and economic nature.
Uthi okwesibili ngacela ukuthi bengibukele ukuthi kwakuyiziphi lezi zimo ezazihluke kangaka ezenza ukuthi isimali sesivukele isizalo sase-St Lucia. Kusho lokho ngoba i-management plan yalesi sizalo ithi singavula kuphela uma kunezimo ey'hlukile. Wasethi ababuke lezo zimo ey'hlukileyo konke okuthinta indalo, okuthinta iy'mpilo zabantu, nokuthinta njeke iy'mpilo zey'lwane ey'phila kuleya ndawo.
Thirdly, to advise on the impact of the mouth opening on the functioning of the estuary system and the wetland system as a whole, as well as the associated environmental, social, and economic implications.
Uthe ngabe sengithi ababuke ukuthi umthelela wolokhu kuvuleka kube yimuphi konke ekusebenzeni kwechweba ngokusebenza kwendalo nasey'nhlalweni kumbe inhlalonhle yabantu abakhelene nalo ichweba kanye nomthelela okwenakho kwezomnotho ezikhiqizwa abantu abasuke besondelene noma benza imisebenzi ebaphilisayo besondelene nalo ichweba.
And lastly, I asked the panel to develop guidelines for the immediate and ongoing management of the system going forward.
Thoba sengicela ngithi mokugcina lezi lezini ukuthi bese ngiyobe umhlahlandlela ukuthi leli chweba lizolawulwa kanjani ukusuka manje leya phambili. Ekhuluma ukuthi umhlahlandlela uzolawula indlela uzokwenza ngayo manje nokuzokwenza ngayo ukuqhubeka kwesikhathi kuya phambili.
So the first finding of the review is that the breach was contrary to the JEF recommendations, but it was permitted by the Estuary Management Plan for ecological reasons.
Uthi-ke ukuthumelela ikomiti okokuqala nje ukuthi ukuvulwa komlomo ngendlela owavula ngayo kwakuphambene ney'nqumo ezazenziwe i-J5 report. Kodwa kwakuhambisana nosomqulu olawula ukumanejwa kwaleli chweba obizwa nge-Estuary Management Plan.
So, accordingly, the iSimangaliso Wetland Park Authority performed the breaching within the mandate as provided for by their maintenance management plan, and that maintenance management plan had been authorized by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, and it was in line with the prescriptions of related legislation.
Ngamafuphi kusho ukuthi-ke ukuvulwa kwalowo mlomo ngendlela owavulwa ngayo uvulwa isimangaliso kwakuhambisana nomgomo isimangaliso esimisele khona futhi kuhambisana nokushiwo somqulu olawula ukuphathwa kwaleli bhange. Lowo somqulu okwathi futhi ugunyaziwe umnyango wakwa-Fisheries and Forestry and Environment okuyibona mnyango vele isimangaliso esibika kuwona nokuyibona mnyango futhi ogunyaza bonke osomqulu abasuke benziwe isimangaliso.
Secondly, the panel found that there were many ecological reasons that would justify the breach, including the prolonged separation of the system from the sea. I think at that stage it was about 7 years. The concern over the accumulated sediment in the system, the presence of alien invasive species, a decrease activity within the system and a decrease in the nursery function of the estuary.
Uthi-ke futhi okuvelela ukuthi isimangaliso ngempela uma ubheka ukuthi isiphi lesimo esasihluke kangako ukuba ngaze ngifuna kuyavela ukuthi kwakunesidingo ngokozonke kwemvelo ngoba kwase kunesikhathi eside lomfula uhlukene nolwandle okufanele ngabe kuyaxhumana uthi uminisa mhlambe noma engasakhumbuli kahle kodwa ngase kube iminyaka lapho kosikhombisa kayigcine nokuhlangana ulokho kwase kusho ukuthi-ke okwakufanele okumsebenzi waleli chweba ngokwendalo ukuthi kube khona ofisha ababuya bezozalela kwangasenzeki nanokuthi-ke futhi bayasola nje-ke ichweba lase ligcwala ubimbiza lolu abamhlaba balubiza nge-sediments olusuke lukulwa umfula ukusuka phezulu ngoba luyelingelo lwandle njalo uma lihlukana nanokuthi-ke nangendlela izinto ebesenzeka ngayo ngokwendalo iy'lwane ey'phila esimeni sechweba elihlangana njalo nolwandle zasingasekho ngenxa yokuthi amanzi olwandle ayingasakhonakali ngenalapha echwebeni.
Importantly, the review is critical that the estuarine management plan makes no mention of socio-economic factors in its definition of exceptional circumstances, despite several social and economic concerns associated with the prolonged closed-mouth state. And I will say more about this later in my address.
Uthi-ke ukufanele akubeke icace ukuthi lo somqulo okhomba ukulawulwa kwale chweba ukhuluma kuphela ngezimo ey'hlukile ey'thinta indalo awukhulumi ngezimo ey'thinta inhlalonhle kanye nezomnotho babantu abakhele nendawo nabaphila kuleli chweba ngey'ndlela ezahlukahlukene uthi-ke lokhu kusekuletha isidingo sokuthi uma ngabe kumbe lolu ubuyekezo ekubuyekezeni kwawo ufake phakathi ukuthi kunabantu abahlala khona lo uthi uzokhuluma ngalokhu uma eqhubeka empikweni wakhe.
Importantly, the review is critical that the estuarine management plan makes no mention, I've said this, the review adds that non-consideration of socio-economic factors contributes to conflict that exists between the management authority and the community in relation to the management of the mouth. And the panel says that this conflict relates to the fact that many stakeholders want the mouth to remain permanently open, but the panel notes that the St Lucia system is a dynamic system and it cannot be and should not be confined to only one state.
Uthi-ke kulokho kusala ngaphandle kwezimo ezihlukile ey'thinta impilo yabantu kanye nezomnotho wabantu abaphila nechweba ikhona ithimba leli ley'ngcwepheshi elikubone kunomthelela engingaboni ngasolinye phakathi kwesimangaliso nomphakathi ikakhulukazi lo ophila kule ndawo uthi-ke kubalulekile ukuthi uma ngabe sekubuyekezwa losomqulo lokhu lezi zinto okukhulunywa ngazo ey'thinta impilo zabantu zifakwe zibe yingxenye yalokho.
On the impact of the mouth opening on the functioning of the estuary and wetland system, the review found that the opening seemed to have a positive effect on the restoration of the nursery function of the system, and that a number of marine fish for tourism and recreational fishing had been reintroduced. Other positive results included the return of megafauna to the mouth area and the shift from fresh to brackish water in the lake.
Ikhona inkulumo engishiye kancane ekuqaleni lapho uNgqongqoshe ebekuthi nakuba kuvele ukuthi iningi lemphakathi esebenza la bephila ngokudla ngokusebenza echwebeni iyafisa ukuthi ngathi lingahlala livulekile umlomo wechweba kodwa-ke ithimba lochwepheshe liveza ukuthi-ke lokho ngeke kuze kulunge ngenxa yokuthi iselusho ichweba uqobo lusebenza ngey'ndlela eningi kwesinye isikhathi livalekile kwesinye isikhathi livulekile manje ngenzekwa lokho ukuthi lugcine lusesimeni esisodwa usethi-ke njengamanje-ke nakuba kunjalo ngesikhathi uvuleka umlomo ngoNhlangulana wakulo nyaka wabonakala kungena ofishi abebengasaziwa kwi-system obabebonake ukuthi ososayensi bagxileka-ke izinto ezishoyo uma kukhona iy'lwane zasolwandle ey'dlulayo.
But the report noted that the artificial breaching did not help in the removal of sediment or the removal of reeds and alien invasive species. At that time, there was no change in the loss of mangroves or in relief to the backflooding for small and large-scale farmers.
Also science ulombiko kumbe ithimba lelochwepheshe laqaphela ukuthi nakuba kwakuzifiso zesimangaliso ngesikhathi imvula ukuthi kuguguleke lemfucuko ubindiza olulapha kwavela ukuthi kwathi noma sekuvuliwe walisanga laguguleka olulobindiza kanti futhi nendlela ama-mangroves ayevele efa ngayo kwabuka sengathi ayilokhu eqhubeka njalo zange kube ney'nguquko ekutheni nasiyaphila ngenxa yokuthi sekuvuliwe.
So let me now come to the recommendations.
Uthi-ke useze inqomeni-ke manje ezenziwe ileli committee kumbe leli thimba lechwepheshe.
So the panel of experts recommends that according to the maintenance management plan, maintenance breaching can continue in exceptional circumstances. However, the exceptional circumstances, whether they be ecological or social, must be clearly defined before any further action is taken. And while it is understood that the GEF report advises against breaching, in the view of the panel of experts, it is practical and necessary to consider the effects of allowing the mouth to remain closed for years at a time.
Uthi-ke esokuqala isincomo esiphumela leli thimba sithe nakuba kuqondakala ukuthi ukuvulwa komlomo ngendlela okwavula ngayo kuyaphambana ney'ncomo zale-J5 report, kodwa kufanele ukuthi umlomo uvulwe ukuze kwenziwe kuqinisekiswe ukuthi kuba khona ukuhlangana kwalamanzi ngey'khathi ey'thize izimiso ezahlukene. Kodwa-ke ithimba lelochwepheshe lithe kufanele ukuba ichazwe lezi y'khathi ezahlukene, zingachazwa nje kuphela kuncike kwezokwemva kwemvelo, kodwa ichazwe nangokuhambisana ney'mpilo kanye nezomnotho zabantu abaphila kulichwe. Uthe-ke futhi nakuba lokho sekwenzeka, kodwa kufanele kwenziwe ngendlela yokuthi uma ngabe kugwenywe ukuthi kungabi nokuvaleka komlomo isikhathi eside sibuyele esimele besikhona ekuqaleni lapho isimo sechweba sesiphenduka siba ukuhlukile nalokho kufanele kube khona.
Now the second recommendation of the panel is that iSimangaliso must develop and intensify an in-house monitoring plan and build capacity to collect and monitor data. This includes biodiversity data and socio-economic data. And the panel says that future breaching must not take place without adequate ecological monitoring before and after the event to ensure the most efficient breach in terms of intended objectives.
Uthi-ke esinye isincomo sithi isimangaliso kuyofanele ukuthi sibe nethimba elizobhekela ukubuka isimo kumbe siqoqe ulwazi ngendlela iSt Lucia ileki esebenza ngayo. Uthi lokhu kufanele kwenzeke ukuze ulwazi lwanele uma ngabe kuzothathwa iy'nqumo ukuthi kuyavulwa noma kuvalwa noma akuvulwa. Lapha leli thimba-ke elizoqokwa akusilo nje ithimba elizoqoqa idatha ngokwezemvelo kuphela. Kufanele futhi kube yithimba azokusebenza nenhlalonhle yabantu kanye nezomnotho kubantu abakhele nabaphila kuyo iSt Lucia uqobo. Uthi-ke futhi akufanele ngokuzayo kuze kube nesikhathi lapho ikuyophatha isinqumo sokuvulwa nokuvalwa lungekho lolu lwazi ukukhulunywa ngayo. Uthi-ke leli thimba futhi kuyofanele ukuthi liqinisekise ukuthi ulwazi lolu luqoqa ngaphambi kokuvulwa nasemva kokuthi kuvulwe ukuze kubonakale umehluko ngesikhathi kwenziwa lezi zinto.
Now, to assist with relief to farmers in the Umfolozi and Sunduzi flood plan, to the Sokulo community as a result of backflooding to allow any from the floodplain to the mouth.
Uthi-ke umbiko la ofuthi kufanele kwenzeke ukuthi uyasho uNgqongqoshe mhlawumbe kungenzeka lokhu kusonele kakhulu nabalimi bakwaSokhulu uthi umsunduze umfula ukhucululo lemfucuza yemhlanga nakho konke lokhu okumile kuwona ukuze amanzi ekwazi ukugeleza ngendlela efanele kungabi namanzi azoma emasimini abantu bakwaSokhulu.
Obviously, this recommendation is something that falls outside of the iSimangaliso authority. It will require the active participation and commitment of the Department of Water and Sanitation, who are the authority with regard to those channels.
Uthi-ke ucabanga ukuthi kuyacaca ukuthi lokhu okunconywe yileli komiti njengamanje kokukhuculula umfula umsunduzi ukuthi akube ngaphandle komsebenzi wesimangaliso kuzodinga ukuthi kube nokubambisana okukhulu phakathi kwabo zonke inhlaka ezithintakalayo nomnyango obhekene ezamanzi nokwemfucuza okumnyango waziwa nge-Department of Water and Sanitation.
The report also recommends that the dunes must be cleared of invasive species. That facilitates the breaching, the natural breaching of the estuary.
Uthi-ke umbiko futhi uphakamisa ukuthi lapha kulezi ntatshana bese zakheka zolwandle mawuya lapha ebeach kukhona ihlahla zamashoba nomokhesa lena abamila khona. Uthi umbiko lo uyophakamisa ukuthi basuswe labo kheshe labamila lapho ngoba benza ukuthi kube nzima ukuthi ulwandle kumbe umfula ubhodloze ujoyine nolwandle ngokuside.
The panel also recommends that there has to be an improvement between the management authority and all of you as the community. And in particular, the report states that where we are dealing with very technical and scientific information, this information has to be presented to you in a manner standard, but it also has to reflect some of the indigenous knowledge that exists within communities.
Uthi isinqumo esiphakanyiswe yikomiti lochwepheshe bekuthi isimangaliso siqinise kakhulu ukuxhumana kwaso nemphakathi owakhelene naso. Uthi-ke lokhu kufaka phakathi ukuthi ulwazi lwendabuko kumbe lwendalo olukhona lufakwe ey'nqunyeni ey'suke zithathwa kulowo msebenzi osuke wenziwe kungabi nje ukuthi uthathe ulwazi lwesosayensi kuphela. Uthi-ke futhi okunye okubalulekile ukuthi nalo ulwazi lolu olusuke selwenziwe oluthanda ukujula ngendlela ulimi olubhalwe ngayo kube umsebenzi wesimangaliso siqinisekise ukuthi luyahumusheka kosomqulu abazoya emphakathini ngendlela ukuthi amalungu omphakathi akwazi ukuliqonda.
Now, those four recommendations are the short-term recommendations, but there are also longer-term recommendations. And I think that these recommendations are very, very important.
Uthi-ke amaningi iy'nqumo ey'khona zibuya zingasebased ezakheka njengamanje kodwa ezinye zizothatha isikhathi ukuba zenzeke. Uthi kodwa kubalulekile ukuthi ukuze sikwazi ukwenza into ngendlela kuyofanele siyilandele lezi nqumo ngoba zibuya zibalulekile impela.
So what the report points out is that up to now we have been trying to manage the estuary in the absence of managing the whole catchment area of these rivers.
Uthi-ke okuvela njengamanje ukuthi kuze kufike lesi sikhathi esikuso njengamanje kade silokhu sizama ukuthi simanage kumbe siphathe lesi sizalo sisihlukanise nayo yonke lemfula nemfudlana engenela kuyona.
And the origins of the sediment issue and the backflooding issue result from the way in which the whole catchment is managed and not just as a result of the way in which the estuary mouth is managed.
Uthi-ke kanti ubindiza lelo ugcina seluyinkinga lapha ezansi kanye nokuthi kube khona ukuma kwamanzi ngendlela engajwayelekile ey'ndaweni lapha asema khona akusiwo nje umthelela wendlela okuphathwa ngayo echweba kuphela kodwa kufaka phakathi yonke imfula egelezela kuleli chweba.
And so we are going to have to bring together ourselves and the Department of Agriculture Agriculture and the Department of Water and Sanitation so that we develop this thing which is called a reserve determination of ecological water requirements.
Uthi-ke kufanele ukuthi-ke sihlangane nomnyango wezolimo siphinde sihlangane nomnyango wezamanzi ukuze sikhiphe lo somqulu olawulwa indlela imhosha engenela emfuleni emkhulu egcina ingenele olwandle efanele iphathwe ngayo.
Now I want to return, ladies and gentlemen, to this issue of the socio-economic factors and how they impact on the estuary management plan.
Uthi-ke usefuna ukuthi abuye kulolu daba lwezenhlalonhle yabantu kanye nezomnotho kubantu abaphila kuleli chweba kanjani ekuphathweni nje kwechweba lilonke.
Now South Africa, as you probably know, is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity.
Uthi-ke njengoba sazi ukuthi i-South Africa isayinile kulo